Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Conscious 2. And my guest in the studio today is Marilyn Hamilton. Hi, Marilyn.
Hi.
And we're here in Budapest at the Integral European Conference. And in today's interview, we're going to explore Marilyn's concept of integral city, and Marilyn is the author of the book, Integral City, and also coined the term the human hive, which is really, I guess you can say, Marilyn, in a sense, using the concept of bees and hives as a way of understanding our cities and that part of our lives.
Yes, well, actually there's a subtitle to the book, and the subtitle is Evolutionary Intelligences for the Human Hive. And so I started to explore the integral when I was looking at learning and leadership in self-organizing online communities. But I'm the kind of person who always likes to take theories like the integral and say, how do they work? If they really work, what does it look like in real life?
Yeah.
And so I started to ask questions about where else might we see patterns that could inform us.
Yes. And of course, one of the things that's, I live in London, so living in a city that has a lot of noise, a lot of complexity, a lot of different experiences are going on. It can often feel like something which is almost the antithesis of quietness and spaciousness and simplicity. And it's very interesting that you have a different perspective.
Yes, well, people who are also in the integral community always want to say, well, are you going to, is your idea of the city that somehow we're going to levitate to a certain point of development and, it's all going to be sort of one clear consciousness zone? And I actually laugh just like you're laughing.
London?
Right? Because when you think of London or New York or even the small city that I live in, Canada, I actually think life is fully there and will always be there. So we're born to learn,
yes.
And so I started to inquire, where else can we see evidence of intelligence? And I learned fairly quickly that the most intelligent species on the tree of life of the invertebrates is the honeybee, Apis mellifera.
Wow.
And I went, oh, that's really interesting, because we're supposed to be the most intelligent species on the vertebrates.
We like to think that.
We like to think it. But in deference to ourselves, because we do beat ourselves up as a human species a lot these days, do you know the honeybee has been around for 100 million years?
Wow.
100 million years. And when we look at the human species, Ken Wilber said the other day, it's about 175,000 years old. And some scientists will stretch that out to 1 million. But either number, when you compare it to 100 million years,
we're only 1% of the age.
We're a very young species,
Yeah.
And we're still learning a lot. So I asked myself, what could our species learn from the most intelligent species of the invertebrates, who lives
Great question.
They live in a kind of a city. Do you know that the beehive has about 50,000 bees in it? A small city, if you will. But, I have a rather eclectic past, and I'm also an accountant. And one other thing I learned about bees was, they have a goal. Did you know that?
Didn't know that, no.
Yet they have to produce 40 pounds of honey a year to survive. And I teach sustainability, and I went, now that's very interesting, because when I look at how we do organizations that succeed, we always want a goal.
Yeah.
And if a natural system has a goal, and in this case it's actually measured in terms of energy, their energy being honey. And where do they get it from? They get it from the flowers in their ecoregion,
Yes.
right? And so I started to think, now bees have a goal, they have something comparable to a complex system. How are they resilient? Because they have managed to populate the geographies of all the world. Every major geography in the world has honeybees. How did they do that? Because this world has got a lot of threats and dangers for such a small being. So the intelligences of honeybees are endless. They're fascinating to study in and of their own. And one thing we've learned about them is they not only have a goal, but bees have a way of communicating with each other. Have you ever come across that before?
You know, I think I have read about it. Yeah.
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 They have a dance. They
Yeah.
call it the Waggle
Yeah.
dance. And so when a bee comes back into the beehive, it goes through actually a little figure 8 and says, you know, the flowers over there, they're blue and they're in really full bloom and they're
Yeah.
about 2 kilometers that way and the sun is at that angle. And
I didn't realize it was quite that sophisticated.
it's very
Wow.
sophisticated, very
Yeah.
sophisticated. And
Yeah.
in fact, they've learned all this because they can train bees to disclose this information, and so that they actually learn in situ. But it's even more fascinating than that, because scientists have taught us that there is a pattern to resilience. And there are 4 major roles in any living system that really manage to interpret how to respond to adapt in systems that are constantly changing, which of course the world of the bees is. And so they have 4 roles. And the first one is called, and these roles were identified by Howard Bloom. Isn't that a wonderful name? He wrote The Global Brain. But he was an etymologist before he was an author and even a rock and roll impresario. So he noticed that what he knew about bees, he could apply to all of the crazy people he saw coming to rock and roll bands. So the first role is conformity enforcers, and they're about 90% of the hive. The second ones are the diversity generators. They're maybe about 5%. And then there's inner judges and resource allocators. And what happens is these conformity enforcers are the ones that go out, and we've got some flowers right here, and they come along and they say, okay, there's lilies, and they'll come back to the hive and they say, those lilies are over there and they're really good, and there's a lot of pollen. And when they come back to the hive, you know, if 90% of them are doing this dance, I say it's a big rave, right? It's like a huge party, right? And the resource allocators have the role that says, right, you brought back a full load, so we'll give you some more bee juice, 100% load, and you can go back for some more.
I love how after 100 million years you still get to rave.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, party time. But you know what happens when 90% of the hive keeps coming back to the same cluster of flowers? It depletes, right? And there's nothing there. And those resource allocators say no production, no reward.
Yes.
So they cut them off. They stop giving them the bee fuel.
And I remember reading this in the book, which was, and then they move on.
But you know what makes them move on? The party stops. And those bees get very depressed. And I say they're like walking around really bummed out, like, you know, teenagers who have nothing to do. And they can measure this depression in bees through the pheromones. So it's not just, I'm not just using, they can actually measure it. So what happens to these really depressed bees is they then notice what the diversity generators have been doing, because instead of them coming here, the job of the diversity generators is to go everywhere else than the conformity enforcers. And so, but they always come back and do a different dance, right? Maybe a line dance.
There's a lot of dancing that goes on.
There's a lot of dancing. So all of a sudden, those really depressed bees all of a sudden notice, oh, there's a little party going on over here. Maybe we should check it out. They go and check it out, and they then find a new source of energy, right? They come back, and the resource allocators top them up again, and the rave starts all over, in a different location, right? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So they actually have this very graceful way of rewarding the performance that gives them the energy that they need.
And they are able to sustain life in a way that's in tune with their environment.
Not only that, the environment itself is being restored with renewable energy, because what are they doing? They're pollinating all those flowers, right? So this is such a fascinating, elegant system. After 100 million years, I figured, how do we notice this in human system? Yes. So I think at the scale of a city, and I've noticed that those roles can be filled by what I call the voices of the city. So the conformity enforcers, I think, are the citizens. You know, you, me, and everybody who's in a city is a citizen of some kind. And those diversity generators, those are our entrepreneurs and our developers, right? They're always bringing
disruptors.
That's right. But they're always giving us new ways to do things. Yes. And they're always ignored until we need them, right?
And then the geniuses.
Right. But the resource allocators are what I would call our civic managers. So they're the people that make the city work. You know, everything from city hall to the education system to healthcare to emergency response to justice. So
what we call in the UK civil servants.
That's right, civil servants.
Structure,
And so the more common name now is called civic managers.
Right.
And then the fourth group is very interesting, I think, are the civil society. So they tend to be the NGOs and the not-for-profits. And I actually think they're the role of the inner judges. They're the ones that are kind of saying, you know, what we're doing isn't really working for the well-being of the city. And we need to think about things differently. So they're a lot of times the activists and the conscience of the city. So when we take these four voices of the city, we then have really a whole system that we can bring into the room. And what can make a difference to the health of cities is that we honor this, right? But what I've noticed is that each one of them is also what I would call a gateway. So sometimes it's the citizens who have the energy, right? When they're doing that rave and everything's going well, they've got the energy and they can really bring the city into the resonance that they have. Sometimes when a city gets into real danger, they need those civic managers because they're the ones that can say, right, we've got a traffic jam here, and unless we get it all sorted out, you know, we're going to have the whole city stopped, or there's been a fire, or there's been a flood or something, and we need them to take charge so that they can sort it out. And at the same time, you know, you hear these days that cities get into the economic doldrums, like 2008, 2010, that's caused a lot of cities to go into meltdown. And so those entrepreneurs, the innovators in the city, are the ones that we're starting. Hasn't anybody got some answers for us that is different, that can sort of bring us into a new way of being together?
Yes.
So these days, you know, we've had years when things were economically going well. We kind of ignored a lot of the civil society, just sort of expected them to do their good caregiving work. But now we need them to be our conscience and say, how are we treating each other? How are we caring for one another? How do we look at this as a whole? So those four voices are within the city, and I think they're comparable to the beehive. That's the way I've looked at it.
And it seems, in a sense, those voices also existed in the individual, in a sense, and their own different expression as well. And so, for someone living in a city, and it feels noisy, polluted, it feels the complete opposite of their inner kind of path. And I think there can often be a sense of just not engaging with that. It sounds like part of what you're saying is that there is an invitation to actually engage with these issues and to actually see the different roles that different people can play to actually co-create something that's different.
Yes. And I actually think that the energy can come out of any one of those voices. So in my own home city, where I do a lot of experimenting to see if these ideas work, there's been a real grassroots movement that actually created a vision for the city.
Yes.
You know, we had the same mayor for 33 years. It kind of got like same old. Sure. But the citizens sort of created a dialogic process over 3 years called Imagine Abbotsford, and out of that came real inspiration to take the city in a sustainable direction. I was called in by city planner in Carolini in South Africa. So there the energy was, what is it going to look like here in 2050 when the energy systems have all changed?
Yes.
You know, and we don't have oil and we need to be accessing solar. What does that mean for us? And I've also worked in Mexico, where it was a citizens observatory, which was kind of like a civil society that really had a lot of participation from many organizations. And they wanted to actually learn how they could be an oasis against all of the challenges for drugs and that sort of thing. And then I've also been invited into a city by some business people in a small city in the United States who said, well, we've learned how to be good leaders. We've learned how to really take care of our organizations. How can we give this back to our community? So amazingly, what we want to see happen as people awaken spiritually, like a lot of people do conscious capitalism, these are guys out of conscious capitalism who've said, let us make a conscious community. And they've invited me in for a long-term engagement.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. You know, and you know, one of the things that also strikes me in living in a city, which is, it's very odd. It's, you know, I've moved a number of times over the years within part of North London, and how there at one time I lived 2 years in a building where there was a converted church. There was about 20 apartments in there, and I never knew a single one of my neighbours.
Yeah.
And it's different now. My wife and I have 2 small children, so of course through the children you know everyone.
That's right.
But it's a really odd thing how we can live in a society where there's many people living very close together, and yet not engaged. Not be part of that community. What do you see supports people in engaging in community, in engaging in these kinds of issues?
Well, one of my precepts is follow the energy. So that's what the bees do, actually. They follow the energy. And I find that anybody can notice if this matters to them. All they need to do is start to find another person it also matters to. And you might notice that when you're going to work, that somebody's reading a book. What would it take to start a conversation? Would you like to go to coffee? I'm really interested in that book. And then I ask, as you get the sort of strength in numbers, and it can be a small group. Margaret Mead said that it's a small group of people who can change the world. Then the next question to ask is, who else should be here?
Yes.
Who else should be here? And start to look. Do we have anybody who's a diversity generator? Is there anybody who can stir the pot?
Yeah.
Is there somebody that we know from maybe the education system, a teacher or administrator, and invite them in, and maybe civil society. And then you notice all of a sudden you've got people with different ways of looking at any particular issue, and they're more likely to be a whole way of bringing intelligence and spirit and consciousness to engage.
Well, one of the things that seems just developing what you were saying seems very interesting, that the number of small grassroots movements that have actually started to spring up. Like one of the things that, using London as a reference point, which is very interesting, is how farmers markets have become this huge thing. It's like in most parts of London now, on a Saturday or a Sunday, there's a huge thing that happens. That wasn't there 10 years ago, and it's like there's enough people wanting to cut out supermarkets and deal direct with farmers and to have locally sourced and seasonal organic food, that it's fundamentally changed the landscape of what's happening.
Literally, and agriculture has become an urban experience now. And it's food again, right? Just like the bees, it's food.
And you actually get to buy food from the people that make it and produce it. And there's something about that just feels so much more, for me, so much more appreciative and connective of just having this something on a shelf where there's no heart. It feels like there's no heart and passion that's gone into it.
So it's a perfect place for you to open up a conversation, and you notice what matters to you. You drop a little bit on somebody else. There's the energy. What would happen if we went over there and tried the croissants we just bought and talked a little bit about that? I think that is a phenomenon that's happening around the world, that people have discovered the power of breaking bread together and growing it together. Right. Yeah. So I think that really opens up.
Yeah. And what do you see as the potential? If what you're describing in terms of the capacity for change to happen in cities and the different roles that are played, and let's say if the human species manages to live another 99 million years, which is a separate question maybe, but what maybe in the kind of nearer future, what would you like to see more of happen, or what do you hope to be a catalyst of? What's the potential that's there?
Well, you've sort of approached it from two sides. I really do believe that when I believe we have the intelligence to solve all of the big issues that we've got. So people get really depressed about how much we are threatened, and they're not trivial threats, and I certainly treat them all seriously. But I also know that there's enough science and understanding and even compassion in the room for us to engage. And so we actually have to create the conditions that allow us to align our intelligences instead of scattering them all over the place. And I think that it will be different in each city, but when you create safe conditions for people to be together, and food, as you've pointed out, is one of the fundamental ways for people to feel the long lineage and heritage of our species of breaking bread together. That's how we start the conversation.
Yes.
And when you look at it from the other side, how can people who are facilitators, or as myself as a catalyst is a good word, is that one of my jobs is to ask, who else should be here? Because sometimes people forget or they don't know to ask that question. And then they say, well, what do you mean? And I will notice, well, who innovates? Or I can ask, one thing that a catalyst or an outsider can do is ask the undiscussable question, right? Why isn't there a food market here?
Right.
Why is it that people are afraid to be on the streets at night? And after the silence, my job, when those difficult questions come up, is to create the safe space for people to start talking about what's in their hearts. So there's an enormous amount of unending work for people who would like to be of service in this way as catalysts. And yet I also believe that life shows us there's a great deal of hope.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying, and we've got about 2 or 3 minutes. I'm curious as to what, in a sense, I think sometimes what happens is people tune out of the big issues. Sometimes they feel too overwhelming. That it feels like what can one person do to really do something fundamental. And I guess I'm curious as to what do you see helps people move from that place? And you mentioned, for example, community and talking to others. That sounds like a really important piece of it. What else helps people to engage with city life, with these bigger issues, in a useful way?
Well, a lot of civic managers have been trained to be the experts, and they now are worried about not having engagement. But when you have experts that have been delegated the job, then you don't engage. So both sides need to learn to invite the other in.
Yes.
So the civic managers need to drop the expert resistance and actually listen to what the citizens and the civil society and the business have to say. On the same side, what I find when I get people to, actually experiment with what it is to be in these different roles, and I get the citizen who's never thought about how challenging the job of the civic manager saying, I had no idea their job was so difficult. Right. So let's sit together with each other.
Yeah.
It sounds so simple, but by inviting the other in, all those 4 roles are others to each other.
Yes.
And so when you start with mindfulness for yourself and open up care and compassion to simply be with the other and listen. Listen is such a gift we can give each other. And in the listening, something arises that is more powerful from the whole system and from life. And we can listen to our hearts as well as what the other person is saying, and actually have the courage to share what comes up for us. I'm afraid, I had no idea that you were afraid. I'm afraid too. And together overcome it and discuss and discover what it would take to keep ourselves safe instead of to be afraid.
And there's something very different of I'm afraid as a revealing of vulnerability, rather than a vulnerability covered up with an attack of you're wrong, this shouldn't be this way.
Yes.
There's something that's more disarming and more powerful in a sense of that.
Yeah. Teaching dialogue is one of the fundamental things I do to help others catalyze, because the fundamentals of dialogue are listen, respect, and be open. Right? Don't judge. Be open. And those are very simple rules. And I always use it as kind of an ulterior agenda or motive, and kind of pepper it into the system, sprinkle it like spice around.
Bit of stardust in the system.
Like honey, I would say. Take us back to the bees.
Complete use of the metaphor.
Pollinate the system with dialogic processes that are intelligent, that don't just stay in the circles, but actually lead to, let's take the first next step.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Well, thank you, Marilyn, so much. And this is Marilyn's book again, Integral City. And thank you for watching, and look forward to talking with you again, hopefully very soon. Bye-bye.